Okay, good afternoon. My name is Jake Kurtzer. I'm the Deputy Director of the Humanitarian Agenda Program here at CSAS. We're really excited to have this panel, and thank you all for staying through lunch and joining us. For those of you who are here in the morning for this first annual Washington Humanitarian Forum, the first conference that's put on at CSAS focused exclusively on humanitarian issues. We're incredibly excited and privileged to have with us this wonderful panel here today to look at a slightly different thematic on the issue of humanitarian crises. The theme of our day and the theme of the report that we launched this morning was on access, the ability of aid providers to reach affected populations and vice versa. And when we were thinking about panel compositions for the course of the day, we put forward this idea of the role of humanitarian journalism. Information is such an important part of humanitarian emergencies, and journalists are at the forefront of informing how international audiences understand and respond to and engage with humanitarian crises in places that are complicated, complex, often far away, that are hard for international audiences in the United States to understand. And so we're very lucky to have with us Heba Ali from the New Humanitarian, Sherine Tadros now with Amnesty International, and Arwa Damon from CNN. So without wasting time on long introductions, everyone knows how to Google. So you can read their extensive, I would hope everyone knows how to Google. I want to just jump right into it and leave as much time as possible for our panelists to share with us their expertise, and as well to have time for Q&A from the audience to know how you feel about some of the issues that they talk about. So I'm going to start with you, Heba. I'm just going to put the big question that we titled the panel straight to you. And given your role as the director of the New Humanitarian, how do you see the field of humanitarian journalism, and what evolutions have you seen over the course of the last few years that have shaped the way these crises are covered?
Thanks, and it's nice to be here. Thank you all for being here as well. For us, the main concern that we have is that at a time when humanitarian crises are getting more frequent, more severe, and longer lasting, the media coverage accompanying those crises is dropping. So we're sitting at the nexus of these kind of opposite trends where the crises are going up and the media coverage is going down, and we're one of very few players that remain in that space. We did a survey with our readers, who are largely policymakers and practitioners in the humanitarian sector last year, and 3/4 of them felt that there wasn't enough coverage of humanitarian crises by mainstream media. And particularly in-depth analysis and investigative journalism were lacking, whereas we might see some breaking news. And where mainstream media do cover crises, this survey described that coverage as sporadic, as partial, as simplistic, and so both the quality and the quantity were in question. And then another study that I found shocking that took place in 2016 by some academics was a survey of 20,000 English language international news outlets. And they looked for coverage of 4 humanitarian events or incidents that took place in 2016. The conflict in South Sudan, the earthquake in Aceh, the World Humanitarian Summit, which was the UN's first ever summit on humanitarian issues, and the annual appeal for funding. And of those 20,000 newspapers and news outlets, 12 covered those 4 events. We were one of them. The Washington Post was, CNN International was, Chinese national TV, and a few others, but that's pretty slim pickings. So that's for me the starting point. We have seen in the last year or two a number of news outlets that were dedicated to trying to cover these kinds of issues shut down for financial reasons. I'm thinking of News Deeply, Humanisphere, Bright Magazine, the International Reporting Project. So there are very few players left in this space, and that for me is pretty dramatic. And so what are the consequences of that? Well, we know that media coverage has an influence in leading to attention and resources being directed to humanitarian crises, but also a huge impact on public awareness. And there was a recent survey that found, for instance, that 42% of British adults did not know where Yemen was on a map, nor that there was a conflict happening there at a time when Yemen is deemed the largest humanitarian crisis on the planet. So I think the situation is pretty dire.
It would be interesting to go to Yemen and ask them how the Yemeni population, how many are familiar with Brexit? And I suspect you would find a massively different differential because of what's deemed important by outlets. Before we move on, I wanted to ask you about your organization, the Humanitarian. Can you talk to us a little bit about the decision that was made to rebrand from what used to be known as ARIN to the new Humanitarian? What motivated the decision to disassociate from the UN, and what are the opportunities and benefits and costs of making that decision to go an independent route?
Yeah, it hasn't been easy, although we're very happy about changing the name because ARIN was a horrible UN acronym and even our staff didn't know what it stood for, so that's been positive.
What did it stand for?
It stood for Integrated Regional Information Networks. Leave it to the UN to come up with that, yeah. So we spun off 4.5 years ago now, and then we just rebranded this year to become the new Humanitarian. I'll be very frank, the motivations for the initial spin-off was that the UN no longer wanted to pay for it, which is an indication of the financial times in the UN, but also there had been increasing tensions around editorial independence. We had always been an independent part of the UN, but increasingly, and I covered Syria at the time, there were a lot of limitations on what we could and couldn't say, and certain articles never saw the light of day because they were considered too sensitive. So the huge opportunity for us in spinning off is to have that full editorial freedom to be able to report not only the impact of these crises on affected people, but also the international community's response, and to be something of a watchdog over the humanitarian aid sector and be able to say when the UN is failing in Syria or when UNHCR is involved in a multi-million-dollar corruption scandal in Uganda, as it has been, or when WFP is incapable of protecting the privacy and the data of very vulnerable people, as it has been. So we now have really entered a new aspect into our reporting, which is this investigative watchdog role over the aid agency, which we weren't able to do before. I'd also say, though, that it's an opportunity for us to reach new audiences. So when we were part of the UN, we had a very clear audience, which was the people working for the UN, the NGOs, the government aid departments, but today the people that are involved in humanitarian response are expanding so dramatically. You're seeing the private sector involved, you're seeing citizen volunteers, you're seeing people like Greta Thunberg, leading a whole campaign. It's a much more heterogeneous landscape, and we want to be able to speak to people that are outside of the formal humanitarian sector. That said, it comes with a lot of challenges, primarily financial, but also logistical, but we are working our way through them.
I'm going to want to sort of put a pin in this watchdog thing because I'm curious how taking on that role has impacted your ability to access information from those organizations. But I just want to move down now to Sherine. Also, picking up on the theme of transition, you're now the head of the Amnesty International's office in New York, the UN representative for one of the world's preeminent human rights organizations. And I'm curious if you could talk to us about the transition from doing the reporting on humanitarian crises that you were doing with Al Jazeera and Sky News before to now working at Amnesty. How do you see the relationship between the humanitarian human rights advocacy and the reporting on the ground from those crises?
Thanks. I mean, the first thing to say is how different it was, and I think that was a huge surprise for me, thinking that essentially I was going to work on a lot of the same conflicts in a lot of the same countries, but from a different angle. But it turned out to be, so completely wildly different. I don't do any of the documentation, but essentially what my colleagues do is human rights investigations and documentation as opposed to the reporting. And there is a huge difference there because the intention when you're on the ground as a reporter is to collect stories and to be able to give that information out to the world. And really that's all you're there to do. Whereas human rights investigators are there to document what's going on to a degree whereby we could then give that documentation over for criminal cases and for accountability in the future. And I think that often those two things are confused, as if human rights investigators do the same work as journalists. And they are very different things. And that's what struck me about this title, about humanitarian reporting. And in my own lifespan, transitioning from a journalist for 15 years to an advocate in the last 3 years, I've really sort of had a lot of time to think back about what I would have done differently as a journalist, having the training now as a human rights advocate. And the difference really is, I think, in the training I've received about international law, and especially international humanitarian law. And the truth is, if I could go back and do one thing, just one thing differently in my career, it would be to have had just some basic training in international humanitarian law and IHL, because we are so often as journalists in the field at times when human rights investigators are not. And whereas I agree that a journalist's job is to take the stories, transmit them to the rest of the world, it's not to be there forever questioning and documenting. There were definitely certain points of my career whereby had I asked certain questions and gotten certain information, it really would have helped in terms of justice seeking at the end. And that was particularly the case in Gaza in 2008 with white phosphorus, for example, which rained down on the Gaza Strip for 18 days. And my reporting was so basic in that time, because I was very much a rookie, that when I came out and I was asked by the human rights community and by the UN to testify on certain issues to do with where exactly it fell and how long it burnt for, and in that one area where it fell, where you documented it, who else was living there, and all of these things that you don't think to ask. And I do think some basic training would really have gone a long way, even in my own reporting, to be able to report in a way that was not just helpful for the future, but also a lot more accurate. I think we confuse as journalists a lot of, we talk about war crimes without being completely aware of the Geneva Conventions and what is not a war crime. We think that whenever a kid is killed, that is a crime of war. It absolutely isn't. We're confused about the question of proportionality and where it lies. And accurate reporting is so important in these conflicts. It's so important for the post-conflict phase as well. So, I'm a big proponent of that.
Do you think that the resources are there and journalists, by time crunch or whatever, are not accessing them? Do you think that there needs to be more done on the part of now organizations like Amnesty, but the ICRC or whomever, to make a greater effort to reach out to journalists? And rather than go back and forth, I want to ask you about the Gaza experience as well. The issue of the report that we launched this morning is access, and my understanding is during that particular conflict, you were the sole international correspondent in Gaza. And how did that reality impact your sense of responsibility to get the story right, even if not to the level of detail of human rights reporting, but to put forth an accurate, objective analysis of the conflict, given that you had a sort of a singular voice in that time?
To your first question, I think that it's not laziness on the part of journalists, or not having the time as much as it is not really knowing that you should be doing this. And I do think that the ICRC, especially, who run fantastic courses, by the way, on practical ways in which you can use IHL. I think that we, and Amnesty International should do a lot better, honestly, at reaching out. I only just now started a course at CUNY at the journalism school, where I do very basic IHL training with journalists, and we're still trying to see, there's not a huge amount of pickup, quite honestly, but when we do come and we do start talking about it, we get more people joining. So, I think that it's an outreach problem. So in Gaza 2008, it's so depressing because you have to qualify which Gaza war because of so many, but this was the first assault on the Gaza Strip post-siege in 2008. Israel and Egypt closed their well, borders, they're not really borders, but they sort of your access into the Gaza Strip. And me and my colleague were the only foreign, if you like, correspondents inside of Gaza at the time. And so we remained just like the 1.8 million Gazans inside, trapped inside of the Strip. And I think, for me, again, I was such a rookie, and I was barely 25, and it was my first major conflict. In fact, it was really the first time I'd been in a war zone. So it was an awesome responsibility. I have so many regrets about things that I should have done better in that conflict. But it goes to show the sort of unique exposure that you have as a journalist. You are privy to these people's lives at the worst points of their lives, and sometimes, if you're lucky, at the best moments of their lives too. But it is such an incredible privilege to have, and that is why I feel really deeply about making the most and having the best training and the tools and being equipped to deal with what it is that you're reporting on. It's really sad to see so many reporters flooding into conflicts without the right tools, without even for their own protection. And it really matters. I mean, at Amnesty, when we go into a conflict and we start to collect documentation, if we realize that we're going to be speaking to a lot of children, we have a child rights experts there. If we know that we're going to be speaking to women who have been subject to sexual abuse and rape, we have a woman there. We make sure that there are people who can speak the language. I think it's really important if you want to do a solid job and do the story justice, to do your homework. And so often that is not the case these days in reporting.
Turning now to you, Arwa, as the senior international correspondent for CNN, and joining us, we're very grateful, from Istanbul. I want to put a slightly bigger picture question to you. It is no surprise to anyone who watches the news that public officials from both democracies and more authoritarian regimes around the world have basically taken an all-out assault on the media, and the mainstream media in particular. And in doing so, undermining to a certain extent the legitimacy, or attempting to undermine the legitimacy of mainstream media sourcing. How does that impact the way you personally cover these very political, very sensitive conflict stories? What does it mean for you, for your reporting, for you personally? And again, I would sort of put the same question. Does it give you a greater sense of urgency to get the story right?
Thank you. It's a very loaded question.
In terms of, this is actually for me one of the most terrifying things, is watching sort of this erosion of trust and faith in some of the mainstream media, because I think it's very dangerous on multiple fronts. I do recognize that, we, all of us, collectively speaking, need to do more, and we need to do better to try to regain that trust. I think part of that responsibility is on us as members of the media. And I think you see it unfold in a number of very different ways. First of all, when it comes to reporting from the areas that I generally tend to report from, which are very much sort of the war zones, the humanitarian crises, and that sort of a thing, oftentimes you are in situations where you are potentially in danger, where the people you work with are in danger, especially our local staff, and then where the people you speak to could also quite possibly end up being in danger because of what they're saying. And so you have that physical aspect of it that you're being assaulted by, and then now you also have this added aspect that you have to take into consideration when you're filing your report and how you're trying to do what you're doing. Has it altered the way I work in the field? No, I have not changed my standards of how I report and what I try to achieve through my reporting, but it does add a certain level of what more can I do to really transport the audience into this moment. Because there is this overwhelming sense of, if only our readers or our viewers could just live this one moment for 5 seconds, we could change their perspective. We could maybe make them understand a little bit more, have a little bit more compassion, or care a little bit more. So that desire to want to put that into your reporting is severely amplified in today's greater context. because of the severity of what it is that we're reporting on, because of the reality that the impact of journalism is being diluted and doesn't necessarily generate the kind of response that you would want it to, and because I do feel that we have an added responsibility because of the assault that we're under in terms of our credibility.
Wasn't meant to be loaded. One of the issues we touched on in the report is the intersection increasingly of counterterrorism efforts and humanitarian action, where the dual policy imperatives of, and we focused sort of exclusively or primarily on the United States, but we also talked about the United Nations and other sort of donor countries, where the imperatives for counterterrorism and national security policy agendas run head-on into the humanitarian programming that these countries fund and promote through their appropriations. And you recently came out, you did reporting from the Al-Hol camp in Syria, which is among the most complicated humanitarian environments in the world today. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you saw there, how you saw that particular dynamic manifesting in that very, very complicated environment?
So Al-Hol, just briefly, is a miserable, wretched camp of about 70,000 people, mostly women and children. And the vast majority of them are those who held out to the very end in Bahos during the battles against ISIS. So the camp has basically been nicknamed sort of the ISIS camp, or the wives and widows of ISIS and their children. You have the foreigners who are on their own. There are about 10, 11,000 of them. And then you have the Syrians and the Iraqis. And it poses a challenge like no other. There is no other refugee camp like this in the world, and there is no blueprint to deal with the security, moral, and humanitarian dilemma that Al-Hol presents. But at the same time, it needs to be dealt with, and yet there is this sense that everyone is just hoping that they can shove all these people into this camp, and the problem is somehow just going to go away, or if it doesn't go away, none of us are going to be impacted by it. Well, that's not quite the case. There were a couple of things that were quite striking to me in going in there and in reporting on the story. And first of all, not everyone in this camp is ISIS. Not everyone subscribes to the ISIS ideology. It is incredibly prevalent in the camp. The ideology is alive, and it is being executed and implemented by a percentage of the really hardcore ISIS wives and widows who are there. But at the same time, you have this other population of the camp that is being subjected to this and has no chance to be able to get away and extract themselves or extract their children from being constantly exposed to this poisonous ideology. There is no mechanism to try to separate the hardcore from those who have rejected ISIS. I think that is very dangerous, because if history has taught us anything, is that the longer this population is left to fester like this, the more abandoned they feel, the easier it is going to be to exploit them in the future, especially when it comes to the children. The children are the most heartbreaking aspect in all of this, because they have known nothing but violence. They have been taught, by and large, a certain narrative that is the ISIS narrative, that is that the West is against us. Anyone who doesn't subscribe to our ideology is against us. And living in this camp is doing nothing but really further that perception that many of them have been taught, if not directly by their families, then by other elements that they've been exposed to. You have this cycle of hatred and anger that is being passed on from generation to generation, not necessarily because of a belief in ISIS, but because a lot of the women there have either had their husbands killed in the fighting, or they've been detained and they haven't heard from them in 7 months, and that would infuriate anybody. And so women are growing angrier and more frustrated because they're not getting answers to their questions about, where is my husband? Where is my teenage son? When are we going to get out of here? That anger is being passed on to the children. They're being told, the infidels did this to us. And then you have the element of, the foreigners that are there that no government really wants to deal with at all either. They are viewed as being the most extreme, and there's a lot of focus on the foreign element of it, which is a good thing in terms of the reporting, but I think there needs to be an equal focus on what's happening in the Syrian and the Iraqi sides of the camp as well. Especially, again, if we look back at history and where ISIS found its origins and how susceptible and vulnerable those two populations are when it comes to exploitation by these kinds of groups. But the bottom line is that Al-Hol really is the intersection and the crossroads of what to do when it comes to security and what to do when it comes to a humanitarian program. And if you fail on the humanitarian side, there is no way that you will ever win on the security side. And this is not going to be a problem that's just confined to that. And so to the bigger picture of all of this, I think it is absolutely ludicrous to have a counterterrorism policy that does not have humanitarian efforts at the very top. And it goes back to very basic human emotion. If someone is filled with anger and resentment and has been abandoned and subjected to only evil and cruelty in their life, you are not going to change their narrative and their perspective unless it is by showing them something different. And that comes with the humanitarian work.
Thanks. I wanted to ask you, you co-founded INARA, an organization that provides medical care for children in conflict environments. And I'm curious how you balance the advocacy effort of that organization with the journalism that's reporting on some of the same conflicts, the conflict environment in which the group that you're working with, that you're trying to advocate on behalf of.
So I actually don't find them to be in conflict at all. And CNN has actually been very supportive of my effort to do this. So basically my charity evolved from my reporting on the ground. And all of us have seen this when we're out there. But in 2007, I did a story on this little boy named Yusuf. He was 5 years old. It was Iraq. No one gave a damn about Iraq at the time. There was Iraq fatigue and people just didn't want to hear about the war. And this little boy and his father show up in our office. And he had had gasoline thrown on him. And he was set on fire when he was playing in front of his house. And his face had hardened into this mask of frozen rivers of scar tissue. He couldn't open his mouth. He was angry. He was barely speaking. He was lashing out to his family. The only thing we could do was report the story. And we didn't know what kind of response it would get. We didn't think that there would be much of one. And frankly, what happened really shocked all of us, because we had a response that was across the globe. It transcended ethnicity, religion, nationality. People came together behind this little boy, and he ended up in Los Angeles. And this was about 10, 11 years ago. And today, and this is what I found really extraordinary, he doesn't remember the attack. He used to be able to tell you about it in detail when you spoke to him, 5 years ago. Now, for whatever reason it is, his initial memories, his initial life experience is not necessarily defined by this horrific act of violence. When Syria rolled around, and there was a lot of apathy towards Syria, and the journalism wasn't really, resonating, I decided, based on that experience and on the situation that we find ourselves in, that I needed to do more. It wasn't enough to just be a journalist. And oftentimes we come across kids who need help, but you can't always do a story on them. But we figure it out because we all have connections to people, and we can kind of make it happen for the family. So why not do this as a charity that can tap in? And really what we do is we figure out what gaps exist in medical assistance, and then we build our program to try to fill those gaps. So we're not competing with anybody. We're actually complementing what's already out there. And the reason why I don't think this is in conflict with my work as a journalist is because when we go out into these situations, we're human beings first. And I fundamentally believe that we have an obligation to help where we can. And sometimes I can help as a journalist by telling a story, and sometimes I can't, so at least I have the option of being able to help with a charity. And what we've seen is that it does change children's narratives. And that impact isn't just on the child, it's on their social circles, and it's on the society. When you intervene early, medically speaking, with a child, you can most often reverse, if not entirely, then partially whatever injury it is. They go from being a burden on their family and on society to being better functioning individuals in the future. And with everything that's happening around us, I do believe that we absolutely have to do everything we can to try to help where and when we can. It's not enough just observing what's going on anymore. It just isn't.
To jump in on that if I can, because I'm also getting a bit tired of this kind of, and I'm not suggesting it's coming from you, but this implicit suggestion that if we're quote-unquote humanitarian journalists, then we're somehow not neutral or independent or impartial in what we're reporting, that we have some kind of bias. And we get that a lot, especially because of our history within the UN. And I think we need to distinguish between our motivation as human beings, our mission as organizations. For instance, we're a nonprofit. Our mission is to inform the prevention of crises and the response to crises. So we do hope that our journalism will contribute to more effective and accountable humanitarian action. You want to call that a bias, you can, but our tool is independent, professional, evidence-based journalism. So even if we hope it's going to have some positive impact on the world, it doesn't mean that we are, as Sherine would do now in her job, making recommendations or telling you what the right way forward is, even if we hope that there is a better way forward. And I think that distinction often gets lost, and it can be very frustrating for people like us.
Yeah, it's because last week, every year I think Esquire republishes on 9/11 the article about the falling man, the photographer who took that picture, the iconic picture of one of the people who jumped from the Twin Towers. And the interview with the photographer, he speaks and he says, when I'm in photography mode, it's automatic. I just take out the camera, I take the pictures. That is my purpose for being there, is to document. And I don't think these are fundamentally different. I think it is in some ways a different approach, because he was sort of saying my job, my purpose there was not to help. It was to document, and documentation is helping. And I was thinking about that when thinking about this panel, of that approach that particular photographer had. And I think he's very haunted by the picture, but it's a pretty incredible capture of that particular moment in time.
Just quickly, that said, there is forms of documentation that will be more helpful than others. And the lens that you choose to take on a particular story, the stories that you choose to tell, the people that you interview when telling those stories, the voices that you highlight or don't highlight, all has an impact on the final product. And so you can, and we believe that we distinguish ourselves by having a certain set of editorial values about how we're going to go about doing our journalism in these kinds of environments, where we will make an effort to speak to local people, for instance, and make sure that their voices are heard, where we will make an effort to tell a story that rings true to experts in humanitarian response, and that we're not sensationalizing, et cetera, et cetera. That ultimately we hope will mean that our journalism is in the service of people who are affected by crises, but that doesn't mean you're doing advocacy.
Sherine, let me just turn to you. We are a Washington-focused institution. This is a Washington-focused day, but you've come down today, we're very grateful for it, from New York, where the whole UN hoo-ha is happening right now. So can you just tell us a little bit about now sitting in New York in that environment, how in that sort of more international space, how the diplomats that you engage with, you have a very interesting perspective, right? You've got representatives of the entire world there, how they, based on your experience with them, how they take in this information, what they look for in reporting on these crises, what's your take on how this information is received at that particular audience?
So we started this whole thing by sort of talking about the difference being a reporter and then being a human rights advocate, and my sort of naive thinking that there was a similarity, and I think that I did go into it thinking that maybe, just as Arwa said, if we could take you to Syria just for 5 minutes, you would change your mind. I thought that if I could take a policymaker or the US expert on Myanmar to Bangladesh for 5 minutes, that it would make a difference. And, I don't want to sit here and depress everyone, but it really doesn't. But it's the absolute truth, because as I'm sitting right here, there is a Security Council meeting on a ceasefire resolution on Idlib, and there will almost certainly see the 13th veto by Russia since 2011. Yeah, there you go. And so, I think time and time again, what I'm seeing is how little humanity there is in these circles that we run in at the UN, that how sterile that environment is, and how the politicization of especially the Security Council has meant that there is no room for real stories of real people. So we can have Nikki Haley standing up and showing pictures of dead Syrians because, you know, that is serving her agenda that day, but never will she stand up and show dead Yemeni kids that US bombs and weapons helped to kill. So at best, we can find that sort of human touch and human stories coming in when it serves the politicians, but you know it's really quite disingenuous most of the time, and it's a sad realization. And I think I struggle every day to make sure that I don't become one of them, because I think that's the only thing that I can do right now in my position, is to keep bringing it back to the people. But it's another challenge then as a human rights advocate, right? So, you know, the challenge then becomes to try and find a way in order to change language in resolutions, to make a different, not necessarily a moral or sort of a human rights angle to it, but a different strategic angle that might speak to the diplomat in front of me. But I think it's naive to think that the other considerations are there. Having said that, I do want to go back to the point of how important journalism is to the narrative that's told and why diplomats might care about a certain subject at a time. I think it was 2015, just at the start of the Yemen war, I was still a journalist. I was working for Sky News, and we were told that there was a UN flight, a WFP flight, leaving from Djibouti into Sana'a. We all scrambled to get to Djibouti. There were a few crews there once we got, you know, on site. We even checked in our luggage to, you know, we were going to be the first, you know, journalists, non-Yemeni journalists to enter Sana'a during the war. So everyone is, you know, all the journalists super excited. You could see the Emmys in the horizon. And then just after 5 hours of waiting for this flight, the guy comes in, he goes, really sorry, but the Saudis saw that your names as journalists were on the list, and so they grounded the flight. And we could see these tons and tons of food that was meant to be, airlifted into Sana'a were now grounded in Djibouti because of us journalists, because we insisted to be on that flight, and because, you know, we'd put so much pressure on the UN system to allow us in, and now these people weren't going to get their humanitarian aid. And I would say that there are various notches that took me out of journalism, and that was one of the big notches where I felt so incredibly guilty for it. But to turn that around, now I feel very differently about that story, because now I feel that sitting in the rooms with diplomats, hearing them actually quote Arwa's story on this, or whoever's story on Yemen, and so on, I have seen the power and the difference it makes, sometimes in a way that our reports, our long 50-page reports about exactly what happened in this one area in Houthi-controlled Yemen, will not get that kind of traction, but what the journalists do when it's accurate really, really does. Not just because it affects public opinion, it actually affects certain decision makers. And if you're lucky enough for them to be watching your piece and you've done a good job, I think it's incredible the impact that journalists can make. I never saw that from the inside, but I can absolutely see that from the outside.
One of the thinking behind the panel was also, having spent some time with humanitarian organizations myself, a certain sense of affinity or similarity between the industries as they were. And one of the criticisms of humanitarian organizations is you sort of parachute in, donor-driven Western organization comes in and tells how to fix the problem. And I think the humanitarian community has identified that as a problem and pledged to fix it. I'm not sure that the fix is happening yet. One of the efforts towards fixing it is the so-called localization agenda of, transitioning as much of the humanitarian response process as possible to local organizations. And so I sort of was thinking about, well, what's the journalism equivalent? And so I'm curious, in your work, how do you see the importance of engaging the quote-unquote, for lack of a better word, local voices, and giving the platform you might have as an international outlet to the local people, the local voice for them to tell the stories themselves. Arwa?
I mean, excuse me, the local voice is the story. I do not for a minute think that any of us can go out to anywhere that we report from and do it without the local support that we have on the ground. Not to mention that the psychological and emotional and physical security-wise impact on them is much more severe than it is on any of us. And they stay when we leave. And that being said, they're the ones that really understand, what's happening, especially when we do parachute into these stories. I mean, look, I spend a lot of my time reporting on Iraq and Syria. I have a pretty good read and understanding of what's going on there, but there are many times when even there I find myself in situations where I need it explained to me by someone on the ground, whether that's our local staff or, more importantly, the people that we're going and talking to. And I think I especially, in my reports, my team and I, we really try to focus on, for the most part, only talking to the people on the ground. It's their voice, it's their story. And the big disconnect that we see right now, not that you need me to explain this to you, is the policymakers. When was the last time anyone who's making a decision right now on what's going to happen in Idlib, Syria, actually talked to a Syrian who's living in Idlib, Syria? Was anyone in the massive sprawling camp city asked whether or not they would like this to be turned into a safe zone that they can end up basically being trapped in with no option to go into Turkey or into regime-held Syria because they don't find it to be safe enough? And the problem goes down to that. So as much as we try to lend, local voices to our reporting, and they're the voices that should be heard, that is not then translating into the decision-making process, and therefore a lot of the decisions that end up being made are not made based on the right parameters or how to best suit the populations. And so, we rely heavily on our local staff. Humanitarian organizations are having to rely very heavily on, their staff. But they're also under different sorts of pressure because you do have this huge politicization of humanitarian aid in these wars that have absolutely no red lines, no boundaries, no rules of engagement, and where no one is being held accountable.
Well, I'd just say it's not only the decision makers like in New York, it's also the UN in country. And I remember when I was in Afghanistan, in 2 weeks, I saw more of the country than the UN staff that had been there for 2 years. So, everyone's got their bunkers. In terms of the localization question, we have always felt that there's a better model for journalism than parachute journalism. I think Arwa was absolutely right that when you are dedicated to covering a particular region or topic, over time, you can overcome the challenges posed by parachuting into an environment. We try to work as much as we can with local journalists who are citizens of the countries that we're reporting about, who speak the local language, who understand the culture and the history and the wider context. It's not always possible. It's been really difficult, especially when you need journalism that's speaking to an international audience that needs a certain, style and approach. Local journalists who haven't had the same kind of training don't always have that capacity, but at the very least, we try to work with journalists who are residents of those countries and who are committed to covering these issues for the long term because we believe you tell a different story.
I might.
Just one reason why it's really important as well these days is the access issue, to bring it back to your report, because, by 2016, when I left journalism, I was a Middle East correspondent that could no longer actually get into most of the Middle East. So I couldn't, it was huge restrictions in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, Saudi Arabia. At the time when I worked for Al Jazeera, most of the countries in the Middle East wouldn't let us in. It was incredibly difficult. And this is also, as an Amnesty International person, a big issue. Our access in country, not just in conflict countries, is so severely limited. So this question of using, local voices and even other sort of more creative things like using satellite imagery and so on. This is a different era of journalism that we're, and also doing humanitarian work and human rights investigations because you can't access the country. And that's the same for the UN. Fact-finding mission in Myanmar to Burundi to, most of these missions, Syria, the Commission of Inquiry, they have no access on the ground. And so our, the sort of tools that we're using to get information and documentation is vastly changed.
I want to give the floor to questions from the audience here. Please, if you have questions, be brief and share your name and affiliation that you might have out of courtesy for our panelists and the rest of the audience. So please, questions? We've got 1 and 2. We'll take 3 or so and then we'll go. Carolyn will come up with the mic. Right here in the front, and then
Thank you very much for the nice presentation. Nice to see you, Arwa. My name is Zahir Sahlul from MediGlobal. We send medical missions and work with local communities to scale up the healthcare to the population. We work in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Venezuela, and Rohingya in Bangladesh. I have 3 brief questions. The first one is about the apathy that all of you spoke about. And in my view, this is an ethical issue. Post 9/11, people in the West in general are less sympathetic to victims who look like Muslims. And this is not me reporting, but this is many people. I mean, the head of World Vision said that they received in 1 week after the Haiti earthquake in terms of aid more than what they received in terms of aid to Syria after 6 years. So this apathy toward victims who look like Muslims, who have beards and stuff like that, how can you overcome it? The other thing is about what you've mentioned about the access of reporters to conflict area. I was in the first session where the head of the humanitarian arm in the UN talked about Idlib. None of the chiefs of the UN have visited Idlib or Aleppo or places where people are slaughtered by a member of the Security Council. So how can you speak about an issue if you do not go and visit these? I'm talking about 3.5 million people in Idlib, for example. So this is the other issue. And the third thing about Russia Today and some of the journalists who undermine what you do, and your reporting by saying this is all the West. CNN is the West. Amnesty International is the West. So everything you do to some sectors of the communities is nullified by reporting by Russia Today and some of the journalists who align with that type of reporting.
Hi, thank you to the panel as well. It's a very interesting topic. My name is Joey Boyer. I work with Bluemont, and some of my colleagues actually work in Al Hol to support the camp management sector there. So I guess my question is, or more of an observation maybe, there's an immense amount of need in Al Hol, as you're aware, and there's not enough to make up for the lack of service there, et cetera. And there have been a lot of stories I've seen lately, especially in the past month or two, coming out about the situation there and how miserable it is. But there hasn't really been a visible response from either donors or other countries that should be accepting their citizens back, or even a push to start repatriating those citizens. So I'm curious if there's any aim or goal of reporters in this situation to assist with the humanitarian situation or to simply report on it on the ground. I know it's kind of a loaded question, but we see these reports come out, and as you guys have touched on, it doesn't really necessarily push decision makers one way or another unless it's done in a certain manner. So anything you can say about that? Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for participating in the panel. I feel like I've learned a lot from all of you already. My name is Sarah Dennison-Johnston. I'm from the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation. And while we predominantly work to end HIV and AIDS in youth, children, and adolescents and families in sub-Saharan Africa, we also do a fair amount of reporting or documentation of people who benefit from our services, A, for donors, but B, for advocacy purposes. And Arwa, I know that you mentioned the intense threat sometimes to safety, security, for a lot of the people that you work with and talk to. And for us, we want our storytelling to really serve the people that we're talking to, and also sometimes their very identities are illegal in the countries that they work in, or their HIV status is a threat to their well-being, their housing, their livelihoods and whatnot. And so I guess I just wanted to hear from some of you how you navigate, telling stories that you really think are going to put this country or this person or this community in a better position, ideally, but also navigating, the safety and security of the people who are really generous with their time and their story.
Yeah, and I'll go that direction. A lot of the times when we're reporting from these areas, we will end up, because we take this very seriously, being overprotective of the people that, we're interviewing or talking to. So if we have, knowledge or experience in a certain area, we will decide to not share their full name or change their name, give them an alias, or omit details from their story that might put them, that aren't going to take away from the impact of the story, but that might, if broadcast, put them in greater danger. I'd have absolutely no issue with that kind of sort of chipping away at some of the details of a story or at concealing someone's identity. Sometimes we will blur the identities of people who have asked not to be blurred, because I feel that it is well worth taking that extra measure to try to protect them. And a lot of the times, it's broadly speaking, this whole, what is the aim of journalism? Why are we going into these places to tell these stories when, frankly, they aren't changing policy? How many ways do we need to say, when it comes specifically to Al-Hol, for example, if this is not dealt with, it is going to be a disaster. It is already a humanitarian disaster. It is a moral disaster. It cannot be ignored. And to ignore it is to literally breed or help breed the next, revenge generation of ISIS, or an aspect or element of it. We have not just when it comes to that, but when it comes to Syria as well, tried what we think is and was our best to tell these stories in the most powerful way possible, in a way that does justice to the suffering of the victims. And one tends to hope that when you shed a light on something, there is some sort of reaction to that at the very least helps alter the course that that topic or that country or that people is sort of barreling down. The reality is that, as you were saying, not to again depress everybody here, it doesn't generate the change that we would want it to anymore. And I really think that we, humanity, we're at something of a crossroads right now. Either we keep going the way we're going, where we allow red lines to be crossed, where we, humanity, has crossed the red line, where we don't uphold certain morals that we would want to, where we don't believe in certain basic fundamentals, at least truly. We either stay on that course, or we collectively look at the world that we've built and we start to make some real change. Because we're going to be paying the price for the consequences of our inaction in ways that I don't think we even really fully understand right now. And I think, we as journalists have a role. All of us in here in this room have a role to play. I think we need to adjust maybe the way that we're telling stories. We need to maybe be more creative. We need to evolve. We need to see how we can engage people on different levels, whether it's in the country that we're reporting on or elsewhere. But something in this calculus needs to shift.
I can jump in. Sorry, I had to get a cough drop, otherwise I would have coughed my way through Arwa's comments. I want to start with your question and then come back to her point. On the empathy of the public, it's not just Muslim versus non-Muslim. It's also a question of the drama associated with a quote-unquote natural disaster versus a long-term complicated conflict. And it's a lot easier to empathize with the former and a lot harder with the latter. And the latter also lends itself to this idea that, these, I'm not going to use the word I was going to use, but these people are killing themselves. They're, why should I have to contribute to helping them? They're causing the problem. So I think that's another dynamic, and that's not necessarily an ethnic one, although the ethnic racial aspect, religious aspect certainly has a role to play as well. The way we try to combat that, I think we have three options. The first is a very transactional one, and Arwa alluded to it a little bit. This is going to land on your doorstep sooner or later. So you want to pretend it doesn't matter to you, but we've seen what has happened. The Syrian war has now threatened the European Union's entire existence. It has landed refugees in the United States. It's, Same thing in terms of the US war in Iraq initially and the long-term consequences that has had all the way to ISIS today. So that's one argument. The other is that the response to humanitarian crises, which is now a $25 billion industry in the very narrowest sense of the term, is mostly taxpayer money. So your dollars are going to helping these people. Presumably you want to know whether it's well spent and how they're faring. The best argument, which is the one we're struggling with, is the more humane one, and that is that that could be you or me tomorrow. And I think that's becoming increasingly possible to make that argument in a way, you know, we share a common humanity and all that, as Arwa just said, maybe not so effective right now. But with climate change in particular, the crises that might have seemed far away, tomorrow it really could be me or you caught up in that storm. And so I think there is eventually, I hope, a certain awakening that's going to have to take place that makes you realize that people suffering are just like you. And I think our job as journalists is to say, how can we create that empathy, and in allowing someone to connect with the subject of the story on a very human level and understand that their desires are just the same as yours, putting food on the table for their children, getting an education, etc. In terms of the question around that the journalism isn't having the impact, I think what we can start to do, which you've also alluded to, is change the objective. Is our objective to make people care? That was the initial idea of what we're here to do. I think now, because the information landscape is so cluttered, we've got to go a little bit beyond that and be a bit more targeted and say, who are we trying to influence, in what way? How can we connect our journalism to the right audience? So if it's a story about Al-Hol, who has to be reading it? Which decision maker? How do we get it onto their desk? And be much more specific in the way that the information travels, rather than putting it out there and hoping that people are going to care.
But then isn't that advocacy?
I don't think it is advocacy because, again, we are producing the journalism according to the rules of journalism, which is we don't have a point of view, we are neutral and impartial, we're going out there to genuinely see what the story is. Once we've got the story, let's make sure someone reads it. Like, what is the point of doing all of that and then having it sit there? So I think the difference is not journalism versus advocacy, it's production versus distribution, and it's no longer enough just to produce, we need to also distribute. And then the last thing I'd say around the safety of the people whose stories we tell is, I mean, there's all the typical stuff, and Arwa's talked about a bit of that, and like making their names anonymous, being very careful to check with them, explaining to them the potential implications of writing about this stuff, also being conscious of re-traumatizing them through the interviews, and not asking people the same set of questions that they've been asked 1,000 times just for the sake of a story that probably doesn't matter anyway. So, you know, being a bit more selective. But I would say we also have to respect the agency of people. And if someone who is conscious, you know, grown adult decides that they want to tell their story, who are we to tell them not to? And we had an incident recently where the UN Refugee Agency was very upset with us because we had interviewed a number of refugees who were essentially revealing a massive corruption scandal in a resettlement program in Sudan, so that people were paying to get on to the resettlement list out of Sudan into the United States. And they said that we had put the refugees at risk by publishing their names. And we said, we asked them, we checked with them several times, and they said, we feel it's important to tell this story. And at that point, it's their choice. It's a bit like those of you who were in the Ebola session earlier. You know, if the families of the victims of Ebola have the information and they choose they want to do their burial in a certain way, that is their choice. And it's not for us to tell them how to do that. So.
Yeah, on your last point, I think it's such a difficult balance, and in the human rights world, as opposed to the journalism world, there are very, very specific rules as to, you know, what they say is the first rule of documentation is do no harm. So, you know, after that, there's a very specific set of rules about how, and, you know, you reveal someone's identity or not, and re-traumatization and so on. There's rigorous training before you can be in the field. Having said all of that, I have a colleague who works as a human rights investigator for an NGO, and this person went and investigated some horrific crimes in a country in Asia and published the name of a woman who talked about how the police had gone to her home and taken her husband and so on. This person who I know very well and is a friend of mine did an incredible job in trying to make sure that that woman was very, very sure that her name was going to be written, that, she tried to, in fact, persuade her not to reveal her identity, but the woman was absolutely adamant. She really wanted her name down. This is what, she felt the risk, she understood the risk, she said, but she felt like she wanted it to be written down. 3 days after the report came out, the police took her. She was detained for a while and then eventually killed. And I think that balance is so incredibly difficult. And I know that friend of mine struggles with what happened every single day. And I think as journalists as well, there's that struggle. And even when you have the most, stringent rules of, there will be things will slip and mistakes will be made, or things that are outside of your realm of control. I do still believe in giving people agency, but it's sometimes more nuanced, unfortunately. On this question of empathy, I totally agree with Heba. I think that it's less about empathy and more about making things. Are these stories of people relatable and relevant to people's lives? And in human rights terms, that has become such a big debate within the human rights community because we feel like we're losing that battle. Do people really care about human rights? I mean, actually, recently we found that there's no point in saying things like women's rights are human rights because a survey showed that people don't really care about human rights. So by saying women's rights are human rights, we weren't getting to anyone. So, we constantly have that, debate of how do you make things relatable to people and move them in that way. And I'm always reminded of the story, I don't know if you guys remember Aylan Kurdi, also known as Alan Kurdi, who was found face down, a child, maybe 3 years old, found face down, washed up on a beach in Turkey. And that picture of him with his face, and obviously he had died on his way over, he's a Syrian refugee. And it moved so many people around the world, right? It was a turning point, it was seen, unfortunately, now in hindsight, not a turning point at all. But at the moment, a turning point in terms of people's empathy towards the Syrian refugees. Now, I was there just after that photo was taken and spoke to the guy who took that photo and saw the original photos of how Aylan Kurdi was found on the beach. And if you had seen how he was really found, his shorts were not up and his t-shirt was not tucked into them as you saw. I mean, of course, how could he? He'd been in the water for so long. It was halfway down. His his pampers were sticking out and his shirt was ripped and I don't know what, but they dressed him on the beach. And I guarantee you, had you seen that original photo, you wouldn't have related to it. It wouldn't have moved you as much as seeing that other photo, which reminded you of your son or your nephew or your little brother, or all of those sort of emotions. So that's also something not that I think that journalists should dress up kids, but I do think that a bigger effort must be made by those of us in the human rights community as well as journalists to really try and find those entry points so that people can relate. It won't work anymore for us to sort of tell you there's this woman in Gaza and she's this and that. You really need to dig deep and do a better job, I think, in trying to show those, garner that sort of connection between this woman in Gaza when you don't know where Gaza is on a map, and this woman sitting in, New York or Kenya or wherever she is.
We just forgot one question, which was the Russia TV question. Sure. So I'll just touch on that briefly. I'm not going to advocate for RT or any other media that is owned by states whose practices we might find questionable. But I will say that we are kidding ourselves if we don't think that American and UK media have equally strong biases. And so we take very seriously as a media that doesn't belong to any country or try to speak to any constituency, to be conscious of that bias, and the fact that in most of the storytelling that at least this room will be used to coming across, there is a Western narrative at play. And I saw it when I was in Sudan, and there was a very strong Western-driven narrative that this was an ethnic conflict between basically Arabs killing Africans, which was not the case. It was a question of power and resources and competition over resources. I saw it in Syria, in which again we had a very simplistic narrative driven by the US largely, that Bashar al-Assad was this horrible monster and these heroic rebels were emerging to fight for their freedom. And of course we know that the reality was much more nuanced and much more complicated. So I can't remember exactly what the question was vis-a-vis RT, but I think all of us have to be absolutely conscious of our bias and then work really hard, going back to the question around locally grounded journalism, in finding the voices that are closest to the story to tell it, and not depending on a narrative that ends up getting repeated so many times that people take it for granted and forget to even start questioning and seeing, does it really gel with the realities on the ground?
A lot more questions this time. Well, I saw your hand earlier, so we'll start with you here in the, I don't even know what color that is, in the second row. Carolyn? Up here.
Hi, I'm Melody. I'm from the Norwegian Refugee Council. And my question is about when you're working on investigative journalism, how you interact with aid workers in the field. We're also supposed to be seen as neutral and impartial. I have a lot of counterparts who are really uncomfortable speaking with journalists. We saw what happened with NGOs, more specifically around human rights in Sudan, so I know a lot of people are uncomfortable around that, and I'd love to hear how that goes for you.
Okay. We'll go with executive privilege for Kimberly Flowers.
Kimberly Flowers, CSIS. Quick question. Arwa, you talked about like getting that local voice, right, and bringing that through the story. I'm just curious, as women, you know, do you have more access or less access than your male counterparts? Anyway, your colleagues. Been speaking all day. I've lost my train of thought. But do you have more or less access in terms of getting into the people that you need to speak with, and any other sort of challenges, but also like advantages of being a woman, particularly working more in the Middle East?
And then right here on the aisle.
Hi, my name is Kelly Maddock. I work with International Medical Corps, and I am actually in development, so I see a lot of similarities, and I was just hoping for some basic tips, because we usually take the worst facts to give to our donors so that they'll give us money. So how do we say those things without sensationalizing and making it relatable, but still selling our stories?
Okay, let's just hold there so we can do a quick round of answers. And Arwa, you want to start?
Sure. First, to the question about being a woman in the field. I think I have, hands down, a greater advantage than my male colleagues. I feel that we sort of exist in this gray space, so we have access to the men who are sitting around, you know, drinking tea and smoking cigarettes with their AK-47s, and then we get to turn around and go and talk to the women. And that has proven and provided some of the most valuable conversations and nuance to the reporting. Just even briefly, more recently on my trip to El Hod, I was able to go into a tent and see underneath the black. And it's very specific to that story, but walking into El Hod, just seeing all the women in black, it's very dehumanizing. And even to someone like myself who likes to think that I wouldn't have that impression, I didn't realize I had it until I walked into the tent and saw the women without the niqab on. That is nothing I would have been able to do as a male. So I've always found it to be an incredible advantage. Aid workers, often, depending on the story, can be our first sort of call that we try to make. I understand, look, no one necessarily likes us. Everyone's really wary of us. I get it, from the government to the aid workers to the military to even the people that we're actually trying to reach out to, that we want to interview. And oftentimes, you need to be very conscious of that, because the concerns are very valid. People can come in with twisted and warped intentions. And I understand that I need to invest time in building a relationship of trust, no matter who it's with. But, there have been quite a few scenarios where, aid organizations will be our first call that we're trying to make, especially when it's a story that, I have not maybe covered in the past, or when I'm trying to get a real read as to what's going on the ground in an area that I'm not at. By the flip side of that, I've had a couple of situations where, aid organizations have reached out to me and been like, hey, you were just in, outside of Gayyara before the battle for Mosul, and there were literally 400 families living in the desert. Like, how did you get there? We've been trying to reach that area. How can we get there? So I do think that it's a relationship that needs to maybe be better built up, but one that is very, very important. And as for trying to get facts in front of donors, this might not be the best way to say it, but given that I do have a charity, I'm going to take the journalism hat off and put that one on for a second. Getting money is probably the most difficult, bash my head against a blast wall kind of exercise. And it's not about sensationalizing the facts per se, because the worst case scenario is a fact. And if we live in a world where presenting the worst case scenario ends up being the one that we need to present the loudest, because that's the only way to get the money, then that's the way that you have to go about and do it, because that's the reality of the landscape that we're trying to navigate now, especially when it comes to money, to these crises that everyone just goes, oh, it's too complicated, sorry, I can't deal with it. No, you know what? Like, you do need to sometimes present it in that way.
I have to totally disagree with that piece, because we see the bullshit that comes out of aid agencies' mouths every day, and it is so disgusting sometimes. So, sorry, am I not allowed to swear on this?
No, but look, I mean, if you're going to say, it's not about lying about what's happening, but if it's a crisis, then you should call it a crisis. If it's an extreme situation, you call it an extreme situation. I'm not talking about distorting the facts.
But sensationalizing usually is distorting the facts in some way, and I think you'll go much further by just being honest. And donors, as also the kind of chief fundraiser for a nonprofit newsroom, which is a very difficult thing to fund, donors will appreciate honesty way more than an exaggerated story. And if they know that every time they talk to you, you're going to pump up the narrative, they're going to stop taking you seriously at one point or another. And if instead you say, and I think the bit where this becomes the most relevant is honesty in the effectiveness of the aid. If you say, actually, we are failing completely to reach this area, we're having this challenge, we're trying, and I would also say to do that with the media, right? Like, be honest with us too, and then you'll have a totally different flavor to the kind of stories that we put out, because we're not having this kind of simplistic either puff pieces about the NGOs or scandalizing stories about what the UN has done. If we can develop a relationship in which, both with us and with your donors, you're just saying, here's what we're doing well, here's what we're really struggling with, here's the thing that is actually really serious, and here's the thing that isn't really that serious and doesn't actually deserve much money, I think that would totally change the game.
So there's a bit of nuance there, because when what you're saying is at minimum, the honesty on the part of the aid organizations needs to be on their piece of the puzzle, right? And I think that organizations themselves, having been in advocacy for a humanitarian organization, you do struggle with the balance of, not every crisis can be the worst crisis in the world, but for the people in that crisis, it is the worst crisis in the world. And how do you manage going back to the same State Department or the same congressional offices week after week and saying, I know I told you last week that the people in Somalia were suffering from the worst possible situation, but let me tell you about Yemen, when in fact those can be true simultaneously. Both of them, it's this balance of who's got the worst situation is something, it's a grotesque game that we play.
If we keep using these hyperboles and it keeps having to be like the most worst humanitarian crisis in the world, like, where's it going to stop? And at some point we need better ways Like, we need to depend on more than making it sound like the most dramatic story on earth, because as I think we've all talked about, that's no longer working. So let's do some data, let's do, have some frameworks for being able to objectively assess and then prioritize the needs, and not depend on who, like crying wolf, who's screaming the loudest, if you see what I mean. It's an absolute challenge, so I agree.
And because I pinned it earlier, and then I think it relates to the question. So how do you now, in your capacity, with your responsibility that you've self-anointed as calling out the bullshit of the aid agencies, how do you maintain the relationship with the Norwegian refugee councils and the UN agencies that you've disassociated from?
So most of our leaks come from aid workers. They don't see us as the enemy. They actually see us as helping them tell the story that they wish they could say, but they can't. So like journalists, like aid workers are also human beings, and if an aid agency is involved in a corruption scandal, it doesn't mean that the aid agency is corrupt. It doesn't mean that everyone in it is corrupt. And there are a lot of, even in Oxfam, with the massive scandal that it went through last year in having, as I'm sure most in the room know, someone who was running their Haiti operation accused of sexually abusing the underage beneficiaries that they were trying to help. There were plenty of very well-meaning people within Oxfam that were disgusted by what happened and that absolutely wanted that to come out. And in fact, one of the stories that we exposed about that whole debacle was that he had been employed by another NGO years earlier, dismissed for similar sexual misconduct, and then rehired before he then committed it again. And it was an aid worker who leaked that to us because she wanted to expose the fact that there was a systematic problem in the transfer of information between aid agencies and the way that HR was working. So we have a very good relationship for the most part with individual aid workers. We have bad relationships in some cases with institutions. And we get constant feedback from, in particular, UN agencies, I would say. Anytime we expose something, nagging about like some inaccuracy that they want to find in like sentence 75 of the story, and stuff that is often very petty. And there, it's a matter of constant diplomacy, I would say, in when I'm going and meeting kind of senior people in the sector to say, this makes the sector better. Like, every institution in the world needs accountability, and the aid sector and the wider kind of do-good sector is no exception, and we are actually helping you hold yourselves accountable, and you should welcome that. And many of them actually do. And we've had cases where we have written stories that end up being quite critical of a government humanitarian aid department that funds us, and they come back and they say, thank you, you did your job. So I think it can be more sophisticated than the kind of like you're with us or against us approach. And then on the women, I would just say there's an added benefit of being underestimated sometimes, which can be very helpful.
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in on the last one. I think the others have been covered. But, I think Deb Amos from NPR, she has the best answer to this question of what's it like being a woman in the field? She always says, well, I don't know what it's like to be a man, so. And I would echo everything that Arwa said about, the access issues that we can circumvent by being women. I would just add this, that in 2011, for example, and really into 2012 and 13, in the squares of Egypt and the protests, there was rampant sexual assault, harassment, and worse. And in those scenarios, there is a physical disability there. And those of us who are lucky enough to be backed by big organizations and networks that could afford bodyguards and so on to be with us, we're okay most of the time. And, even then, obviously, it wasn't, but there was some sort of protection. But for dozens of freelance female journalists that I know that were operating in those sort of spaces, it was harrowing and often meant that they couldn't be in the protests, or at least they had to leave early and so on. And that is just to say that networks and organizations, news organizations, they need to invest a lot more still in how when they decide to put women in the field. And that's not just in terms of their protection. It goes down to from equal pay to maternity to, all sorts. We have struggled so much, well, not really our generation, to be honest, but our, previous generations have struggled so hard to make sure that we are equal in the field to men, but that doesn't mean that we don't still need certain things, that we don't also need our rights respected. And I think that too often women, because we feel so privileged and lucky that our editor doesn't bat an eyelid sending us to Sana'a or Afghanistan or wherever, that we don't necessarily speak up and say what we actually need to make sure that we can do our jobs effectively.
Can I just say how awesome it is, though, that you have a panel of 3 women journalists?
Mm-hmm.
I would give all credit to that to the director of the program, number one. But that wasn't by design. I mean, what I wanted to have was a diverse set of voices geographically, organizationally, and it happened to be that we have, a panel full of women. So, I mean, otherwise we would have framed it, that wasn't the intention. It just happens to be, and I think that speaks to what Sherine is saying, right? That even as there are, now I'm mansplaining, forget it. Yoni. Cognizant of the time, and because we're going to finish on time, I'm just going to take that one question and then open it up for any final thoughts that you have. So talk about the role or how social media, I'm just repeating it for our online audience who may not have been able to hear, the role and impact of social media, how it plays, especially given in contemporary conflict, social media has actually played a role in fomenting conflict, how it impacts your reporting from mainstream sources, and then, final thoughts if you have them. So we'll start at the end with Arwa.
Well, on a personal level, I find social media very difficult to navigate. Like, that's just me is me. And I don't necessarily fully understand it, and I'm not in tune with all the different little things you can do with it.
Your Instagram's great. You should follow Instagram account. And Inara.
Yes, Inara more importantly. The thing is, I find it both fascinating, and I find that it has this incredible way of connecting us to places and people we don't necessarily be connected to, and at the same time, I find its impact absolutely terrifying. I think we as journalists are still trying to sort of figure out how journalism fits into that, or how that fits into us. Again, I bring it back to Syria. Syria was all over social media. It was the most documented, visually speaking, war ever. And yet the single image had this awesome impact and went viral, and yet did not result in change. On the flip side of that, when something is out there on social media, fact or fiction, it gets this life of its own, and we don't yet have the mechanisms to kind of dial back all of the noise or the fiction that is out there, which I think is something that is potentially very dangerous. I think, as a bigger picture sort of closing statement, I struggle every day to be optimistic about the world that we live in. I question what I'm doing every day. I question whether or not it's good enough. I question whether or not I have done the people I'm interviewing justice, and what more I should be doing and where I went wrong along the way. And a lot of the times, it's hard. And then I kind of kick myself in the face, because what right do I have to even lament anything, because I am, at the end of the day, very privileged to be, where I am in life. And I refuse to stop fighting, whether it's as a journalist or as someone who has an organization who's trying to help wounded children, or on whatever front it is. And I do think that sort of as global citizens and as humanity, we are, as I was saying earlier, at this crossroads. we either allow the status quo to continue and basically barrel down this path of, assured self-destruction, or we figure out where we can all be better and do better, because we don't have a choice right now. I mean, I do think that humanity is at a crisis and at a crossroads. And if we want to save the world, we need to start with, beginning to really change things and figuring out how we're going to save ourselves. And we all have responsibilities as individuals, and it's very to turn away from a story or turn away from a crisis or sit and talk about it and feel really good that we came to a conference and sat on a panel, but then go home and basically not change our behavior. Or we all decide to make our individual changes and then push where we can for policy and governmental changes on a bigger scale. Thank you.
Do I have to follow that? Okay, let me start with social media, and I know my colleagues will sort of, I think, cover the sort of journalism angle to this and how it's been used and misused and then used for sometimes good. But from an advocacy point of view, I can tell you it's been incredible to see how just in the last 3 years I've been at Amnesty and at the UN, how much Twitter has become so important. So to doing advocacy and getting access to people and to governments, quite honestly, that we never could do in any other way. And as an example of that, we lobbied the US mission very hard in the first few years of the Trump administration on certain things, from China policy to Burundi to Yemen. And honestly, we got nowhere, not a single sort of reply to an email, not a single letter back from the copious ones I sent to Nikki Haley. And then one day in the Security Council, I'm sitting there and it's a debate about Israel-Palestine, and I start tweeting at Nikki Haley, and I sort of say what she's saying, then I say what international law says about Israel-Palestine, just to sort of show that it's not the same. And within 1 hour of leaving the chamber, I got a call from her people asking me to come into her office because she'd like to discuss my tweets. And I was thinking, all of these months I have spent writing these letters. And the approval process for these letters at Amnesty, I mean, it took months. And there was my tweets that, from the chamber that made a difference. So there is a changed way in which we can interact with policymakers now, which I find really useful, also a bit dangerous, as we see with, the way Donald Trump's using it. But as my larger point, I would, I guess echoing what Arwa was saying here about sort of, I guess, what I find the most dangerous thing right now is indifference, is how indifferent we've all become. It's not as if we hate the news or we hate watching Syria. We just become indifferent to it. And how is it that, we go back to this point, how is it that us as journalists or human rights advocates, how is it that we can create these connections between the conflicts and the suffering that we are reporting on or documenting, and you sitting here, or your parents, wherever they are, or, your siblings, wherever they are? I think that that's the big challenge, to make people less indifferent.
On social media, I think the time pressures it has put on news agencies are well known. The opportunities that it has given in terms of being able to tell what's going on in a region from a distance based on what's happening on social media, I think are well known, and some of the risks involved. I think the most dramatic thing it has done, though, is allow people to speak for themselves in a way that changes the role of journalists. And I think, if someone in Homs, when it was under siege, can do a Facebook Live and tell their own story to the world, the role of journalists then becomes the kind of, I don't want to say arbiter of truth, but making sense of all of these individual accounts that we might hear from people, rather than being the one that's going to find their voice and tell their voice. They're speaking for themselves. We are then kind of putting pieces together and making sense of things. And I think that is a significant change in our function that I'm not sure we've fully yet comprehended. On the kind of wider closing thought, My wonderful colleagues have given you the emotional answer, so I'll just give you a very practical one, which is that if you believe in the role of journalism in bringing attention to these crises, with all of the constraints that we now face in the empathy piece in particular, if you believe in the need for journalism about people who are suffering some of the worst things in the world today, it's not going to happen by itself. And we are facing more challenges than we've ever faced in terms of the danger to journalists in being in war zones. They used to be kind of exempt, and in the 80s and 90s, you could ride on the back of a truck with the rebels and you'd be fine. That's not the case anymore. We're not immune to the challenges of sanctions. Our organization is now having to deal with how do we report from Syria and Venezuela and other places without getting caught up in this mess as well. And as I said right off the top, the business model is broken. And so there is a policy responsibility for sustaining this kind of journalism. And that's why I'm so pleased that this is actually a panel at a conference like this. It has often been the case that media is a separate conversation for the people interested in media, has nothing to do with humanitarian policymaking. It absolutely does. And knowing the impact that the media have on the decision-making that does take place, decision makers need to pay a bit more attention to the future of this kind of journalism.
On behalf of our program, CSIS, I want to thank, first of all, our donor, USAID, but in particular and specifically Arwa, Sherine, and Heba for coming from a distance to share their thoughts with us today. And more importantly, thank you for your work. I think the emotion with which you speak about the issues in which you're reporting on, it gives me confidence in the field. And so just thank you very much for sharing your time with us today.